Regina Hayes stood at the tall window of her new office on the 7th floor of City Hall, watching the first pale threads of dawn stretch across Riverside's skyline, and she found herself thinking about invisibility. Not the kind from comic books or science fiction movies, but the ordinary, devastating invisibility that came from being seen and dismissed in the same glance. The kind her grandmother had warned her about when she was just a girl, sitting on the porch of their small house on Magnolia Street, eating butter pecan ice cream and listening to stories about strength that looked like surrender. Her grandmother, Mama Ruth, had cleaned houses for white families in Riverside for 43 years, and she used to say that being invisible was sometimes the most powerful position a person could occupy, because the unseeing revealed themselves completely to those they believed weren't watching. Regina had never fully understood that wisdom until 3 weeks ago, on the morning of her inauguration, when a police officer looked directly at her and saw nothing but his own assumptions reflected back. Now, as she touched the cold glass and watched a delivery truck pull up to Riverside Community Hospital across the street, she understood that her grandmother hadn't been teaching her about accepting invisibility. She'd been teaching her how to weaponize it, how to turn the blindness of others into a mirror that forced them to confront what they'd become. The election had been brutal in ways that campaigns rarely acknowledged publicly, a grinding war of attrition fought in church basements and community centers, at county fairs where she'd eaten corn dogs and funnel cakes while answering hostile questions about her qualifications, and in televised debates where her opponent, Richard Thornton, had repeatedly questioned whether a community organizer with a degree from Riverside State University could possibly understand the complexities of municipal finance and public safety. Thornton had been Riverside's deputy mayor for 12 years, a fixture at every Rotary Club meeting and Chamber of Commerce luncheon, a man who knew every business owner by their first name and could recite property tax codes from memory. He'd run on experience and stability, while Regina had run on something harder to quantify but desperately needed. The promise that every voice in Riverside would finally be heard, that the single mothers working 2 jobs at Riverside Medical Center and Patterson's Manufacturing wouldn't be forgotten in budget meetings, that the teenagers dealing with underfunded schools and over-policed neighborhoods would have a seat at the table where decisions about their futures were made. She'd knocked on 11,000 doors during the campaign, her feet aching in sensible flats, her voice hoarse from explaining her vision for community-led public safety initiatives and equitable development that didn't push long-time residents out of neighborhoods their families had built. On election night, when the results came in showing her victory by just 4 percentage points, 52 to 48, the celebration at her campaign headquarters in the renovated warehouse on 3rd Street had been joyous, but tempered by the knowledge that nearly half the city had voted against her, had looked at her resume and her face, and decided she wasn't what Riverside needed. The morning of her inauguration arrived with unseasonable warmth for January in the Midwest, temperatures climbing into the low 50s as Regina woke at 4:30 in her small apartment on 7th Avenue, the same place she'd lived for the past 8 years, the same cramped bedroom where she'd written her acceptance speech and cried into her pillow the night her mother passed away from complications of diabetes 3 years earlier. She made coffee in the old percolator that had belonged to Mama Ruth, the smell of Maxwell House filling the kitchen and bringing memories of Sunday mornings when her grandmother would make biscuits from scratch and talk about dignity, about how no job was beneath a person, but some people placed themselves beneath their own humanity by how they treated those they considered less than themselves. Regina dressed carefully that morning, but not in the navy suit her campaign manager had suggested she wear for visibility and gravitas. Instead, she chose comfortable jeans, a simple grey sweater, and her oldest pair of Nike sneakers because she'd decided weeks earlier that before she stood on that stage and took an oath to serve every citizen of Riverside, She needed to walk through City Hall alone and feel the weight of the building, to touch the marble that generations of leaders had touched, to breathe the air of a place that had never been designed with someone like her in mind. City Hall was a fortress of limestone and glass, built in 1873, rebuilt after a fire in 1921, and renovated most recently in 2005, with federal grants and private donations from families whose names adorned wings and conference rooms. Regina arrived at 5:45 in the morning, using the key that had been presented to her during a stiff, formal transition meeting with Mayor Thornton's team, and she entered through the main doors on Franklin Street, the heavy brass handles cold against her palms. The building was silent in that particular way of empty public spaces, a silence that felt dense and expectant, and her footsteps echoed as she walked across the marble floor of the main atrium, where in just 4 hours hundreds of people would gather for the inauguration ceremony. She moved slowly through the corridors, reading the names on office doors, trailing her fingers along walls that had witnessed 150 years of decisions that had shaped Riverside from a frontier trading post into a city of 200,000 people, a diverse community that had grown beyond the white Protestant roots that still dominated its power structures and historical narratives. When Regina reached the second floor, she found herself standing outside the mayor's private office, the heavy oak door with its brass nameplate that still read, Mayor Richard Thornton. And she felt a moment of vertigo, of unreality, because despite the election results and the transition meetings and the hundreds of congratulatory calls, some part of her still couldn't quite believe that she, the granddaughter of a domestic worker and the daughter of a hospital cleaner, was about to become the first black woman to lead this city. She unlocked the office and stepped inside, flipping on the lights to reveal a space that would soon be hers, but still felt foreign, still carried the lingering scent of Thornton's expensive cologne and the leather of furniture chosen by committees and donors. The desk was massive, mahogany that had been imported from somewhere and refinished too many times, and behind it stretched windows that looked out over Riverside's downtown core, the mix of historic buildings and modern glass towers that represented the city's ongoing negotiation between its past and its future. Regina sat in the chair, testing its weight, and she thought about all the decisions that would be made from this seat, all the lives that would be affected by policies and budgets and appointments, and the responsibility felt like a physical pressure on her chest, like the weight of every person who'd voted for her, and every person who'd voted against her, and every person who hadn't bothered to vote at all, because they'd stopped believing government could work for them. She stayed there for 20 minutes, praying silently the way her grandmother had taught her, not asking for success, but for wisdom, for the strength to see clearly and act justly and remain humble even when power tried to corrupt her into believing she was somehow special rather than simply chosen to serve. When she finally stood and left the office, locking it behind her, she felt steadier, more grounded, ready to face whatever the day would bring. Regina descended the grand staircase to the main floor, her hand sliding along the polished walnut banister, and she was halfway across the atrium when she noticed a dark stain on the marble near the security desk, someone's spilled coffee spreading in a small puddle that maintenance hadn't yet cleaned. She didn't think twice, just walked to the nearby custodial closet where she'd seen cleaning supplies earlier, found a roll of paper towels, and returned to kneel beside the spill, soaking up the liquid and wiping the marble clean the way she'd watched her mother clean hospital floors 1,000 times during the years Regina had accompanied her on late shifts during school breaks. There was something meditative about the simple task, something that connected her to her mother's memory and to the millions of workers who performed these invisible labors that kept buildings functioning and spaces presentable. And she was so focused on ensuring the marble was completely clean that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching until a man's voice cut through the silence with an edge of authority and impatience that made her freeze. The voice said, "Hey, you, what are you doing here this early?" And Regina looked up to see a police officer standing 10 feet away, his hand resting casually on his belt near his radio, his face showing that particular expression of automatic authority mixed with suspicion that she'd seen too many times in her life, the look that said he'd already categorized her and found the category wanting. Regina stood slowly, still holding the damp paper towels, and she met the officer's eyes with the calm steadiness her grandmother had modeled, the refusal to be diminished by someone else's limited vision. "Good morning, officer," she said, her voice clear and measured. "I'm preparing for today." The officer stepped closer, his boots clicking against the marble, and she could read his nameplate now, Brennan in black letters on silver, and she could see that he was maybe 35, with the kind of clean-cut appearance and confident bearing that suggested military background or generational law enforcement, someone who'd never questioned his right to move through the world giving orders and expecting compliance. He looked at her with a frown that deepened as he registered her casual clothes and the paper towels in her hands, and his voice took on a dismissive quality that landed like a slap when he said, preparing, "The cleaning crew isn't supposed to be here until 7. Regina felt the first spike of understanding pierce through her, the realization that he wasn't just questioning her presence, he was placing her in a category, filing her under assumptions that had nothing to do with who she was and everything to do with what he expected to see when he encountered a black woman in jeans with cleaning supplies in a government building at dawn. She could have corrected him immediately, could have identified herself, and watched his face transform from authority to horror, but something stopped her. Some instinct inherited from Mama Ruth, who'd understood that the most powerful revelations came not from telling people what they should see, but from letting them fully display their blindness, so they couldn't later deny it. So Regina simply said, "Look, I don't know who hired you, but there are rules. You can't just wander around government buildings," and his tone had shifted from dismissive to annoyed, as if her presence was an inconvenience he needed to resolve quickly so he could return to his real duties. Regina walked toward the waste bin to dispose of the paper towels, and she could feel his attention tracking her movements, evaluating, judging, and when she turned back toward the corridor that led to the executive offices, intending to return the supplies to the custodial closet, Officer Brennan positioned himself deliberately in her path, his body language broadcasting that he considered himself the authority in this space, and she the interloper who needed to be controlled. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, and Regina paused, weighing her options, knowing that what happened in the next few minutes would either be a private encounter forgotten by everyone or a public lesson that could catalyze change depending on how she chose to navigate it. She said simply, "I need to return these supplies." And Brennan shook his head, the gesture almost pitying, as if he was dealing with someone who didn't understand basic protocols. "Employee entrance is around back," he said. "You need to check in with your supervisor and get proper authorization before you can access the executive floors." Regina felt anger rising in her chest, hot and sharp, the accumulated anger of a lifetime of moments like this, of being followed in department stores and questioned in parking lots and asked to show ID in spaces where white colleagues walked unchallenged. But she channeled that anger into something colder and more strategic, into the decision to let this play out completely, to gather witnesses and documentation so that what happened here could become not just her personal grievance, but a teaching moment for an entire city that needed to understand how bias operated in the mundane details of daily interactions. She looked at Officer Brennan and said, "I understand, officer. I'll get my credentials." And she began walking toward the mayor's office, her destination clear in her mind. But Brennan moved quickly to block her again, his hand now hovering near his service weapon in a reflexive gesture that made Regina's blood run cold, because she knew, they all knew, how quickly these encounters could turn lethal when officers felt their authority challenged by black bodies that didn't immediately submit. He said, "Ma'am," I said, "the employee entrance. That hallway leads to the mayor's private office, and you have no business there." And his voice had taken on a harder edge now, the friendliness completely gone, replaced by the tone of someone who decided she was either dangerously ignorant or deliberately defiant, and either way needed to be controlled. Regina stopped walking and turned to face him fully, and she let the silence stretch for 3 seconds, 5 seconds, watching his certainty solidify, watching him commit completely to his misperception, and then she said quietly but clearly, "You're absolutely right, officer. This is the mayor's office, and the mayor values protocol." And she watched confusion flicker across his face because her tone didn't match what he expected, didn't carry the deference or defensiveness that usually accompanied the interactions he was accustomed to having with people he'd categorized as subordinate. Before Brennan could respond, the sound of heels clicking against marble announced another early arrival, and both Regina and the officer turned to see Janet Chen, the city clerk who'd worked at City Hall for 30 years and who'd been one of Regina's earliest supporters during the campaign. Janet stopped abruptly when she saw the tableau, her sharp eyes taking in Regina's casual clothes and the officer's defensive posture, and Regina watched Janet's face transform from confusion to understanding to something like horror as she realized what was happening. Janet opened her mouth as if to speak, to intervene, but Regina gave the slightest shake of her head, a gesture that said, "Not yet, let this continue," and Janet closed her mouth and remained frozen near the security desk, a witness to what was unfolding but not yet willing or able to disrupt it. Officer Brennan, emboldened by having another person present, someone he probably assumed would support his authority, turned partially toward Janet and said, "Ma'am, do you work here? Can you help me understand what this woman is doing on the executive floor without proper authorization?" And the way he said "this woman" carried layers of dismissal that made the phrase itself feel like an insult, a reduction of Regina's full humanity to a problem that needed categorizing and removing. More staff began arriving as the morning crept towards 7 o'clock, the building slowly filling with the people who kept Riverside's government functioning, administrative assistants and policy advisors and department directors, and Regina was aware of phones being discreetly pulled from pockets, of cameras being angled to capture the confrontation between a police officer and a black woman that was playing out in City Hall's main atrium on what was supposed to be a day of celebration and new beginnings. She saw David Morrison, the city council member who'd endorsed Thornton and had been barely civil during transition meetings, enter through the main doors and pause when he saw the scene, his expression moving from curiosity to something that looked like satisfaction, as if this confirmed every doubt he'd expressed about Regina's suitability for office. Morrison approached with the confidence of someone who belonged, someone whose presence in City Hall would never be questioned, and he addressed Officer Brennan directly, asking, "Is this woman bothering you, officer?" And the question itself was an assault, a reversal of reality that placed Regina in the position of aggressor rather than the person being detained and questioned for the crime of existing in a space while black and casually dressed. Brennan responded, "No, sir, just a misunderstanding. She's with the cleaning crew and doesn't seem to understand building access rules." And Morrison turned his attention to Regina with a look that managed to be both condescending and annoyed, the expression of someone dealing with an inconvenience that was disrupting his schedule. "Sweetheart," he said, and Regina felt that word like a physical blow because it carried such casual disrespect, such automatic dismissal of her authority and adulthood. "Sweetheart, the custodial supervisor is Maria Gonzalez. You should check in with her. We can't have maids wandering the executive floor on Inauguration Day. We have important visitors coming." The word "maids" hung in the air like smoke, like poison, and Regina saw Janet Chen's hand fly to her mouth, saw a young black intern named Terrence Williams, who'd been part of Regina's campaign team, look absolutely stricken, and she felt the full weight of that word settle on her shoulders. Because it wasn't just a job title, it was a diminishment, a placement, a statement about who Morrison believed belonged in service positions and who belonged in leadership, and the fact that he'd used it so casually revealed exactly how deeply those assumptions ran in the minds of Riverside's establishment. Regina remained silent, her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind, saying, "Baby, when they can't see you, that's when you see everything. When they make themselves blind, you become the mirror." And she understood now what Mama Ruth had meant. Understood that this moment of invisibility was revealing more about Riverside's power structure than 100 policy papers or diversity reports ever could. She watched Officer Brennan take her continued silence as compliance, saw him relax slightly as Morrison's presence seemed to validate his actions, and she made the calculation that had been building since the moment Brennan first spoke to her, the decision that what happened next needed maximum witnesses and documentation so it couldn't be minimized or explained away. So when Brennan said, "All right, that's enough. I'm going to need to see identification and I'll need to verify your employment with building management," Regina simply nodded and reached slowly toward the pocket of her jeans, moving with deliberate care, because she knew, every black person in America knew, that reaching for anything in the presence of a nervous police officer could be fatal, and she withdrew her wallet with careful precision while Brennan's hand tightened on his belt and his body. Language screamed readiness for threat. She handed him her driver's license and watched his face as he examined it, watched him read the name Regina Hayes without any flash of recognition, watched him look at the address listed as 450 City Hall Plaza without understanding that the address meant she lived in the secure mayoral residence on the building's top floor, a privilege extended to Riverside's mayors since 1968. Brennan frowned at the license and said, "This says you live at City Hall Plaza. That's this building's address. Are you squatting? Do you have legal residence here?" And the question was so absurd, so completely disconnected from reality, that Regina almost laughed, except there was nothing funny about a police officer being so convinced of his assumptions that he looked at documentary evidence contradicting them and simply reframed the evidence to fit his preconceptions. Morrison checked his watch with theatrical impatience and said, "Officer, maybe just escort her out. We don't have time for this. The inauguration starts in less than 3 hours, and we still have setup to complete." And his willingness to have her removed, to have the actual mayor-elect physically expelled from City Hall on the morning of her inauguration, revealed a brutality that Regina knew she would remember every time she had to work with him going forward, every time he smiled and called her Mayor Hayes in public meetings while harboring the private certainty that she was an imposter who'd somehow infiltrated a position she had no right to occupy. The atrium was filling now. Camera crews arriving to set up for inauguration coverage, city employees streaming in with coffee from Riverside Roasters and pastries from Morrison's Bakery. The normal morning routines of people who had no idea they were about to witness something that would be replayed on national news and debated in living rooms across America. Regina saw James Mitchell, the head of building security, who was a 60-year-old black man who'd worked at City Hall for 35 years, enter and immediately clock the situation with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too many variations of this scene. And she watched James's face move through recognition and calculation before he approached with professional neutrality. "Officer Brennan," James said, his voice carefully stripped of emotion, "is there a problem here?" And Brennan turned with visible relief because James's uniform and obvious authority made him a legitimate interlocutor in a way that Regina apparently wasn't. "Do you know this woman?" Brennan asked. "She claims to work here but won't leave the executive floor, and her ID lists this building as her address, which doesn't make sense unless she's somehow living here illegally." And James looked at Regina with an expression that asked a silent question. Do you want me to end this now, or do you have a reason for letting it continue? And Regina gave him the same small headshake she'd given Janet Chen, the signal that said, trust me, I know what I'm doing. Let this play out. James said, I'll handle this, Officer Brennan, his tone suggesting dismissal. But Brennan wasn't ready to relinquish his authority, wasn't ready to accept that he might have misread the situation. Good, Brennan said. Get her out of here before the mayor arrives. This is embarrassing. And that word, embarrassing, struck Regina as almost funny in its complete inversion of reality, because yes, this was deeply embarrassing, but not for the reasons Officer Brennan believed. The PA system crackled to life, someone testing microphones for the ceremony, and a voice echoed through the atrium announcing, ladies and gentlemen, please prepare for the inauguration ceremony beginning at 10 o'clock. We ask everyone to welcome our incoming mayor, who will be sworn in this morning. And Regina watched Officer Brennan's face as the announcement continued, watched the first seed of doubt plant itself in his expression when the voice said, Mayor Regina Hayes, and she saw his eyes widen slightly, saw him look down at the driver's license still in his hand, saw him read the name again, as if the letters might have rearranged themselves, and she knew this was the moment. This was when invisibility would shatter and force every person in that atrium to confront what they'd witnessed, what they'd participated in, what they'd allowed. The color drained from Officer Marcus Brennan's face as he stared at the driver's license in his trembling hand, his eyes moving between the name printed on the plastic card and the woman standing before him with quiet dignity. And Regina watched the precise moment when his certainty crumbled into horrified understanding, when the category he'd placed her in shattered and forced him to confront the magnitude of his error. The PA system continued its announcement, the voice echoing off marble walls and high ceilings as it invited attendees to take their seats for the historic inauguration of Riverside's first black woman mayor. And the atrium had gone silent in that particular way that happens when a crowd collectively holds its breath, when every person present simultaneously understands they're witnessing something significant, something that will be recounted and analyzed and debated long after the moment itself has passed. Brennan's mouth opened, but no words emerged, his hand still hovering near his weapon belt in a posture that now looked absurd rather than authoritative. And Regina could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the desperate mental scrambling as he tried to find a way to reframe what had happened, to minimize his role, to escape the consequences of assumptions that had seemed so natural and inevitable just moments before. David Morrison, the city council member who'd called her sweetheart and suggested the officer escort her out, had frozen mid-step on his way toward the stage area, his face cycling through expressions too quickly to catalogue, but settling finally on something between panic and defensive anger, the look of someone who knew he'd been recorded saying something indefensible, but wasn't quite ready to accept responsibility for the words that had come so easily from his mouth. Regina saw Janet Chen moving closer, her phone held at waist level in a way that suggested she'd been filming, documenting everything, and Regina felt a surge of gratitude for Janet's witness because she knew that without video evidence, this encounter would be reframed and softened and explained away as a simple misunderstanding, as an innocent mistake that anyone could have made, rather than what it actually was. A perfect crystallization of the assumptions and biases that shaped every interaction between law enforcement and black citizens in cities across America. The young intern, Terrence Williams, had tears streaming down his face, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Regina could see in his expression the accumulated pain of every time he'd been followed in stores, or questioned in neighborhoods, or treated as suspicious simply for existing in spaces that white America had decided belonged to them. And she knew that what happened next, how she chose to respond to this public humiliation, would matter deeply to Terrence and to every young black person in Riverside who was watching to see whether power would actually protect them or whether ascending to positions of authority simply meant enduring racism with better lighting. Officer Brennan finally found his voice, though it emerged strangled and small, nothing like the confident authority he'd wielded just minutes earlier when he'd been ordering around a woman he'd assumed was a cleaning lady without rights or recourse. "Mayor Hayes," he said, the title sounding foreign in his mouth. I wasn't, I thought you were." And his inability to complete a sentence revealed the complete collapse of the narrative framework he'd been operating within. The story he'd been telling himself about who belonged in City Hall's executive corridors and who belonged in service positions, stories that had seemed like natural observations of reality until reality itself refused to cooperate with his categorizations. Regina remained silent, letting the weight of the moment settle on everyone present, letting the cameras capture the full scope of what had transpired. And she thought about her mother Lorraine, who'd spent 30 years cleaning floors at Riverside Medical Center, and who'd once told Regina about the time she'd saved a doctor's life by recognizing the symptoms of a heart attack while the man's colleagues had dismissed his chest pain as indigestion, how she'd initiated CPR and called for emergency response and kept him alive until paramedics arrived, and how that same doctor had returned to work 3 days later and told everyone that one of the security guards had saved his life, unable even in his gratitude to see clearly enough to identify that his savior had been a black woman in a cleaning uniform rather than whoever his assumptions had populated his memory with. Morrison recovered his composure faster than Brennan, his political instincts kicking in as he recognized the need for immediate damage control. And he moved toward Regina with his hand extended and apology already forming on his lips. "Mayor Hayes," he said with forced warmth that fooled no one, "I'm profoundly sorry. If I had known it was you, I would never have." And Regina let him hang there for a moment, his hand extended into empty air, before she spoke for the first time with her full authority, her voice carrying across the atrium with clarity that silenced the growing murmur of conversation. "If you had known, Councilman Morrison," she said, each word precisely calibrated, "tell me, would you have treated a white woman in casual clothes with cleaning supplies any differently this morning? Would you have called her sweetheart and suggested she was wandering where she didn't belong? Or does that particular condescension reserve itself for women who look like me?" The question landed like an indictment, exposing the reality that Morrison's apology was premised on a false foundation, that he was sorry for mistaking her identity, but not for the assumptions that had made the mistake possible, not for the casual dehumanization that had allowed him to look at a black woman and see only a category rather than a person who might occupy any position in Riverside's hierarchy. Morrison's face flushed red, and his mouth worked soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to say, "That's not fair. I was simply trying to help Officer Brennan maintain building security. I didn't mean anything by it." And Regina felt a flash of anger at that particular deflection, because "didn't mean anything" was always the refuge of people whose biases were so deeply embedded, they couldn't recognize them as choices rather than natural observations. The atrium continued filling with people, city employees and journalists and citizens who'd arrived early to claim good seats for the inauguration. And Regina was acutely aware that every moment of this confrontation was being captured on dozens of phones. That by noon the footage would be circulating on social media with hashtags and commentary, that her response to this humiliation would be analyzed and debated by people who'd never experienced the particular degradation of being erased while standing in plain sight. She thought about her grandmother, Mama Ruth, who'd worked as a domestic servant in the homes of Riverside's wealthy families, who'd cooked their Thanksgiving turkeys and Christmas hams, who'd cleaned their children's bedrooms and washed their laundry and listened to their problems while remaining essentially invisible to them, present but not seen, essential but not valued. and who taught Regina that there was power in that invisibility if you learned to use it strategically rather than accepting it as your permanent condition. Regina finally took Morrison's hand, but not as acceptance of his apology, rather as a gesture of control, a physical claim of authority that forced him to remain in place while she delivered the lesson she'd been constructing since Brennan first questioned her presence. "Councilman Morrison," she said, her grip firm enough to prevent him from pulling away, "the problem isn't that you didn't recognize me. The problem is that you saw a black woman with paper towels, and your brain automatically generated a narrative about who I must be and where I must belong. And that narrative felt so natural to you that you never questioned it, never paused to consider that your assumptions might be wrong." Morrison tried to interrupt, to offer more justifications, but Regina continued speaking over him with the voice she'd developed during years of community organizing. The voice that could silence a rowdy town hall meeting or command attention in a crowded church basement. "The issue," she said, "isn't individual rudeness or personal malice. It's systemic conditioning that teaches all of us, white and black alike, to associate certain jobs with certain types of bodies, certain positions of authority with certain skin colors. And until we confront that conditioning directly and honestly, we'll continue having these encounters where people in power look at people without power and see only what they expect to see, rather than what's actually in front of them." She released Morrison's hand and turned her attention to Officer Brennan, who looked like he wanted to sink through the marble floor and disappear entirely. His earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by visible distress that might have been genuine remorse or might have been fear of professional consequences, or most likely some complicated mixture of both. "Officer Brennan," Regina said, and her tone shifted slightly, became less harsh and more measured because she'd decided in that moment that destroying him publicly would serve no purpose beyond temporary satisfaction, that real change required creating space for growth rather than simply punishing ignorance. "Officer Brennan," she repeated, "you've served this city for 12 years, according to your personnel file that I reviewed last week during transition meetings. You've received commendations for bravery and dedication. You've put your life on the line to protect Riverside's citizens. And I don't believe you're a bad person or that you consciously intended to demean me this morning." Brennan's eyes flickered with something that might have been hope, the desperate wish that she was about to excuse his behavior, but Regina's next words demolished that possibility. "However," she continued, "your training and your experience and your instincts all led you to see a black woman in casual clothes and immediately categorize her as someone who needed to be controlled and questioned and potentially removed. And the fact that this happened so automatically, so naturally, without any conscious malice, that's exactly what makes it so dangerous and so urgent to address." The press had fully assembled now, cameras on tripods and reporters with microphones clustering as close as security would allow. And Regina saw Rachel Torres from WRIV News 7 positioning herself for a clear shot, saw Marcus Chen from the Riverside Chronicle typing rapidly on his phone, probably already drafting the story that would run with headlines about the mayor-elect being racially profiled in her own building on Inauguration Day. Regina knew that she could end this confrontation now, could move toward the stage and begin the ceremony and let the media frenzy develop on its own momentum. But she also knew that this was a teaching moment that Riverside desperately needed, that the work of dismantling systemic racism happened not just in policy papers and diversity training modules, but in specific moments when people were forced to confront the gap between their self-perception as good people and the harmful impact of their unexamined assumptions. So instead of walking away, Regina did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She invited Officer Brennan and Councilman Morrison to join her in the mayor's office for a private conversation before the ceremony. a gesture that prompted gasps and confused murmuring from the assembled crowd because it seemed impossibly gracious, seemed to offer unearned forgiveness to men who'd publicly humiliated her. James Mitchell, the security director, stepped forward with concern evident on his face and said quietly, "Mayor Hayes, you don't have to do this. We can have Officer Brennan suspended pending investigation and file a formal complaint. You have every right to pursue consequences." And Regina appreciated his protective instinct, but she shook her head because she understood something that James, despite his decades of experience navigating racism in institutional spaces, might not fully grasp. That her power in this moment came not from punishing Brennan and Morrison, but from demonstrating a kind of leadership that transcended the vindictive satisfactions of payback, that modeled the grace and strength that her grandmother had embodied when she'd absorbed the small cruelties of her employers without becoming cruel herself, when she'd maintained her dignity in the face of people who couldn't see her humanity. "James," Regina said gently, "I appreciate your concern, but I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. This isn't about excusing what happened. It's about using what happened to create change that lasts longer than one news cycle." James held her gaze for a long moment before nodding and stepping back, and Regina noticed the young intern Terence still standing nearby with tears on his face, and she made a mental note to talk with him later because she understood that witnessing this encounter had reopened wounds that never fully healed for Black people living in America. Wounds that were constantly refreshed by headlines about traffic stops turned fatal, and joggers assumed to be criminals, and birds watched while Black in Central Park. Regina led Brennan and Morrison toward the mayor's office, walking with deliberate calm through corridors that had witnessed 150 years of decisions about who belonged in power and who belonged in service. And she was hyper-aware of the cameras tracking their movement, of the reporters shouting questions that she ignored, of Janet Chen following at a discreet distance as witness and perhaps protector. When they reached the office, Regina unlocked the door with the key that represented her authority as mayor-elect, and she gestured for the two men to enter before following them inside and closing the door on the chaos of the atrium. The office felt different now than it had when she'd sat here alone at dawn, less foreign and more like a space she was claiming through the very act of bringing these men here to account for their actions on her terms, rather than allowing the encounter to be processed through the usual channels of administrative complaint and performative apology. She didn't sit behind the massive desk, didn't claim the physical position of power that the furniture arrangement suggested. Instead, she leaned against the desk's front edge in a posture that was simultaneously casual and commanding, and she looked at Brennan and Morrison, who stood awkwardly near the door like students called to the principal's office, their earlier confidence completely absent. "Sit down," Regina said, gesturing toward the leather chairs that faced the desk, and the two men complied with the stiff movements of people deeply uncomfortable with the reversal of expected power dynamics. Regina let silence fill the room for several seconds, using the tactical pause her grandmother had taught her, understanding that silence made people nervous and nervousness made them honest in ways that direct questioning sometimes couldn't achieve. "Officer Brennan," she finally said, "I want you to tell me exactly what you saw when you walked into City Hall this morning and encountered me cleaning that coffee spill. I want you to walk me through the thoughts that went through your head and the assumptions that shaped your response." Brennan shifted in his chair, and his face was still flushed with shame, but he met her eyes with what seemed like genuine effort to be honest, rather than defensive. "I saw," he began slowly, his voice rough with emotion, "I saw a Black woman in casual clothes with cleaning supplies, and I immediately assumed you worked for the custodial service. I didn't think about other possibilities. I just saw what my brain told me I was seeing, and I acted accordingly." His honesty was painful in its simplicity, and Regina nodded because she'd wanted him to articulate the process, to make explicit the automatic categorization that usually happened below the level of conscious thought. And when I told you I was preparing for today, Regina continued, when I tried to walk toward this office, what made you so certain that I was lying or confused? What made you believe you knew better than I did where I belonged? Brennan's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and his knuckles had gone white with tension as he struggled to answer. I thought, he said haltingly, I thought you were either lost or trying to access areas you weren't authorized for. I thought I was doing my job by maintaining building security, and it never occurred to me that you might actually have legitimate business in the executive wing, because in my experience, the people who work in these areas look different. They dress different. They carry themselves with a certain authority that I didn't see in you because I wasn't looking for it. I was seeing what I expected to see instead of what was actually there. Regina felt the weight of that confession. The admission that his perception had been so filtered through expectation that reality itself couldn't penetrate. And she thought about the countless black professionals who navigated workplaces where their competence was constantly questioned, where they had to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition, where they were assumed to be assistants or support staff rather than executives or experts. She turned her attention to Councilman Morrison, who'd been sitting rigidly silent, his politician's face trying to project remorseful attention, but his body language suggesting he was calculating how to minimize the damage this incident would cause to his political standing. Councilman Morrison, Regina said, you've served on City Council for 18 years. You've worked with 3 different mayors. You consider yourself a progressive who supports diversity and inclusion based on the statements you've made in public forums. So I want you to explain to me how a progressive person casually calls a black woman sweetheart and suggests she's wandering where she doesn't belong and refers to her as one of the maids who need to be managed by their supervisor. Morrison opened his mouth several times before words finally emerged, and his voice carried defensive anger that he was trying unsuccessfully to suppress. I didn't mean it the way you're making it sound, he said. I was trying to be helpful, trying to direct someone who seemed confused to the appropriate resources, and the language I used was it was casual workplace language. I would have used the same terms with anyone. Regina let him finish before responding with a question that cut through his justification like a knife. Would you really? She asked. Would you have called a white woman in business casual clothes sweetheart? Would you have assumed she was custodial staff if you'd seen her cleaning a spill, or does that particular set of assumptions activate only when the woman is black? Morrison's face reddened further and he started to protest, but Regina raised her hand to stop him. I'm not asking rhetorically, she said. I'm genuinely asking you to examine your own patterns of behavior and speech, because I don't think you're consciously racist. I think you're unconsciously biased. And the difference matters because conscious racism can be condemned and isolated, while unconscious bias is shared by most people in this society, including many people of color who've internalized the same hierarchies. And the only way to address unconscious bias is to make it conscious, to force ourselves to see the automatic categorizations we're making and to question them actively rather than accepting them as natural observations. The office had grown warm with tension, and Regina could hear the muffled sounds of the inauguration crowd outside, the building filling with hundreds of people who were expecting a ceremony to begin in less than 2 hours. And she knew she needed to conclude this conversation and begin preparing for her official duties, but she also knew that what happened in this room mattered more than any speech she would give from the stage, mattered because real transformation happened in small, private reckonings before it could manifest in large public changes. Officer Brennan spoke suddenly, his voice thick with emotion that sounded genuine rather than performative. Mayor Hayes, he said, I need you to know that I'm Catholic. I go to Mass every Sunday at Our Lady of Perpetual Help on 8th Street. I volunteer with the youth program at the community center. I have black friends and colleagues who I respect deeply, And I've never thought of myself as racist. I've never used racial slurs or deliberately discriminated against anyone. But you're right that I made assumptions this morning based on your race and your appearance, and those assumptions caused me to treat you with disrespect and suspicion that I wouldn't have directed at a white person in the same situation. And I'm genuinely sorry, not just because you turned out to be the mayor, but because no person deserves to be treated the way I treated you, regardless of their job or their status. His apology was more substantial than Morrison's had been, showed more genuine self-examination, and Regina felt herself softening slightly because she recognized the courage it took to acknowledge bias rather than defending against the accusation. But she also knew that feelings of remorse meant nothing without commitment to change behavior. "Your apology matters, Officer Brennan," Regina said. "But what matters more is what you do next, how you use this experience to change not just your own perceptions, but the culture of the police department and the broader community." She looked at both men and made a decision that she knew would be controversial, that her advisors would probably counsel against, but that felt aligned with the kind of leadership she wanted to practice. "I'm going to propose something that might surprise you," she said. "I'm going to ask both of you to participate in developing and implementing a comprehensive bias awareness program for all city employees. I'm going to ask Officer Brennan to share his experience this morning with other officers as part of their training, to talk openly about the assumptions he made and why those assumptions were wrong. And I'm going to ask Councilman Morrison to sponsor legislation that requires this training and allocates resources to support it meaningfully rather than treating it as a box to check for compliance purposes." Both men looked startled. Brennan with something like gratitude beginning to replace the shame on his face. Morrison with calculation as he recognized the political opportunity she was offering him to rehabilitate his image through active participation in reform rather than passive acceptance of punishment. Regina checked her watch and saw that it was 8:30, 90 minutes until the inauguration ceremony would begin, and she needed time to review her speech and compose herself and prepare mentally for the most important moment of her professional life. "Gentlemen," she said, standing to signal the meeting's conclusion, "what happened this morning was painful and revealing, but it doesn't have to define either of you permanently. People can grow and change and become better versions of themselves if they're willing to do the difficult work of examining their assumptions and behaviors honestly." She moved toward the door and opened it, and the sounds of the busy atrium rushed in, along with the reality of everything that awaited outside this private moment of reckoning. Brennan and Morrison stood and moved toward the exit, but Brennan paused in the doorway and turned back to face her. "Mayor Hayes," he said quietly, "thank you for giving me a chance to be better. I won't waste it." And Regina nodded because she believed him, or at least she wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that people were capable of transformation rather than being permanently fixed in patterns of bias and harm. Morrison didn't speak as he left, but his expression suggested he was already calculating how to present this encounter to his constituents and colleagues, already crafting the narrative that would allow him to emerge looking enlightened rather than exposed. And Regina made a mental note to watch him carefully, because political opportunism could mimic genuine change while actually representing nothing more than strategic adaptation to shifting norms. After Brennan and Morrison departed, Regina stood alone in the mayor's office for several minutes, allowing herself to simply breathe and process what had happened. And she felt the accumulated tension of the morning beginning to release from her shoulders, even as she recognized that the hardest part of the day still lay ahead. She walked to the window that overlooked downtown Riverside and watched the city waking fully into Tuesday morning, watched cars streaming along Franklin Avenue toward businesses and schools, watched pedestrians hurrying with coffee cups from Java Junction and bags from Corner Bakery, watched the ordinary rhythms of a city that had no idea its new mayor had just been mistaken for custodial staff, and called a maid in the building she was about to officially lead. The view from this seventh-floor office showed Riverside in all its contradictions. The gleaming headquarters of Patterson Industries next to the weathered brick of the old textile mill that had been converted to affordable housing. The pristine campus of Riverside Community College visible in the distance beyond neighborhoods where poverty and promise existed in uncomfortable proximity. And Regina understood that her job as mayor would be navigating those contradictions, building bridges between communities that had been separated by highways and zoning laws and decades of decisions that had concentrated resources in some areas while abandoning others to disinvestment and neglect. Janet Chen knocked softly on the door and entered when Regina called out, and Janet's face showed the strain of witnessing the confrontation in the atrium, the moral discomfort of having remained silent when she could have intervened to stop it sooner. "Mayor Hayes," Janet said formally, though they'd been on first-name basis throughout the campaign, "I owe you an apology for not speaking up immediately when I saw what was happening. I should have identified you to Officer Brennan right away, instead of standing there like a statue." Regina gestured for Janet to sit, and she shook her head gently because she understood why Janet had hesitated, understood the complex calculations that Asian American women made in predominantly white institutional spaces, the fear of being seen as difficult or aggressive, the learned habit of avoiding conflict even when witnessing injustice. "Janet," Regina said warmly, "you did exactly what I asked you to do when I signaled you to wait, and more importantly, you documented what happened. You made sure there was video evidence that can't be disputed or reframed, and that documentation is going to be crucial for the conversations we need to have about bias and accountability." Janet's eyes filled with tears, and she said, "I've worked in this building for 30 years, and I've seen countless incidents of disrespect toward people of color who work here, maintenance staff and cafeteria workers, and even professional employees who get mistaken for support staff. But I've never seen it happen to the mayor-elect on Inauguration Day. And I'm so angry that you had to experience that this moment which should be pure celebration has been tainted by racism." Regina stood and moved around the desk to embrace Janet because she understood that Janet's tears weren't just about this morning's incident, but about accumulated experiences of being overlooked and underestimated in her own career, about the exhaustion of being a woman of color in government work where competence was constantly questioned and authority perpetually challenged. They held each other for a moment before Regina pulled back and said, "We're going to use this, Janet. We're going to use what happened this morning to create real change in how this city operates, in how city employees are trained, and how community members are treated, and how we think about respect and dignity in public service. And I need you to help me because you understand this building's culture better than anyone." Janet nodded and wiped her eyes and said, "Whatever you need, Mayor Hayes, I'm with you completely." And then she shifted into practical mode and started listing the logistics that needed attention before the ceremony, the arrival times for dignitaries and the seating arrangements and the media protocols. And Regina was grateful for the distraction of concrete tasks that needed completion because it gave her something to focus on, besides the roiling emotions that threatened to overwhelm her if she examined them too closely. By 9 o'clock, the atrium had transformed into a ceremonial space with rows of chairs facing a temporary stage, with camera platforms and lighting rigs, and a podium draped in Riverside's city flag, showing the stylized river that had given the city its name, flowing between representations of the diverse communities that populated its banks. Regina stood backstage in a small preparation room, looking at herself in a full-length mirror, now dressed in the navy suit her campaign manager had originally recommended, her hair professionally styled by a volunteer from Riverside Beauty Academy who'd arrived early specifically to help her prepare. And she thought about the distance between the woman in jeans with paper towels, who'd been dismissed and questioned 2 hours earlier, and the woman in designer suit and makeup, who would soon be sworn in as mayor, and she wondered whether that distance was real or illusory, whether the suit and the styling actually changed anything fundamental about who she was, or whether they simply made her legible to people whose vision was so constrained they could only recognize authority when it came packaged in particular ways. Her campaign manager, Marcus Williams, a 40-year-old black man who'd managed 3 successful campaigns before taking on Regina's long-shot bid, knocked and entered with a tablet showing social media feeds that were already exploding with footage of the morning's confrontation, hashtags like racial profiling in Riverside and see black women, and Mayor Hayes' strength trending locally and beginning to gain national attention. Marcus looked simultaneously proud and worried as he showed Regina the reactions pouring in from across the country, progressive activists praising her grace under pressure, conservative commentators already framing the incident as manufactured controversy or reverse racism, local residents expressing shock and shame and solidarity in roughly equal measures. "This is going to dominate coverage of your inauguration," Marcus said, "which means your speech needs to address it directly rather than pretending it didn't happen. You need to set the narrative before other people do it for you." Regina nodded, because she'd already reached the same conclusion, had already begun mentally revising the remarks she'd prepared weeks ago, the safe and inspirational speech about unity and progress that now felt inadequate to the moment that had been thrust upon them. She took the tablet from Marcus and scrolled through comments, reading messages from black women across America who said they'd experienced similar encounters, who thanked her for not backing down, who celebrated seeing someone who looked like them ascending to power despite the obstacles placed in their path. And she also read the inevitable backlash, the comments accusing her of playing the race card or suggesting she'd staged the confrontation for publicity, or claiming that Brennan and Morrison had simply made innocent mistakes that she was exploiting for political gain. If this story has moved you, if you believe in leadership that confronts bias with grace instead of vengeance, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and turning on notifications so you never miss stories about courage and transformation. Leave a comment telling us what you think. Something like, "A powerful lesson in dignity and justice," to let us know these stories matter to you, because your engagement helps us reach more people who need to hear them. The knock on the door announced the arrival of Judge Maria Rodriguez from the state Supreme Court, who would be administering the oath of office, a 62-year-old Latina woman whose own path to the bench had been marked by discrimination and perseverance. And when Maria entered the small room, her face showed understanding and solidarity that came from lived experience rather than abstract sympathy. "Mayor Hayes," Maria said warmly, embracing Regina with the familiarity of someone who'd supported her campaign and believed in her vision. "I heard what happened this morning, and I want you to know that every woman of color who's ever been dismissed or diminished in professional spaces is standing with you today." They sat together on the small couch, and Maria shared her own story of being mistaken for a court interpreter rather than a judge during her first week on the bench, of having a bailiff try to direct her to the public seating area rather than the judge's chambers, of the constant microaggressions that accumulated like dust until they became a weight that was exhausting to carry. "But here's what I've learned," Maria said, her voice carrying the authority of hard-won wisdom. "These moments of being unseen are also opportunities to demonstrate the kind of leadership that transforms institutions. Because when you respond with dignity rather than rage, when you create teachable moments instead of just punishing ignorance, you model something that changes culture more profoundly than any policy memo or diversity training module." Regina felt tears threatening, and she blinked them back because her makeup was perfect and there was no time for repairs. And she said, "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for not telling me I'm overreacting or being too sensitive. Thank you for knowing that this hurts even when we've learned to expect it." Maria squeezed her hand and said, "You're going to give a speech today that people will remember for years. You're going to set a tone for your administration that makes clear you won't accept business as usual. And some people will love you for it, and some people will hate you for it. But everyone will know that Riverside has a mayor who sees them, all of them, even the ones who've been invisible for too long." They prayed together then, Maria offering a blessing in Spanish that invoked Santa Maria and asked for wisdom and strength and grace, and Regina responded with the prayer her grandmother had taught her, the one that asked not for success, but for clarity of vision and purity of purpose. And when they finished, both women felt steadier, more grounded in something larger than the immediate chaos of politics and public opinion. At 9:45, Marcus returned to announce that it was time to begin, that the atrium was full beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and overflow crowds watching on monitors set up in adjacent conference rooms. And Regina took one final look in the mirror and saw not just herself, but generations of black women who'd fought for the right to occupy spaces like this, who'd endured far worse than being called a maid in order to open doors that had been locked against them. She followed Marcus and Judge Rodriguez through the backstage corridors, her heels clicking against tile floors that had been walked by dozens of mayors before her, all of them white and all but 3 of them men, and she understood that her presence here was both historic victory and ongoing challenge, that she would be scrutinized and criticized and held to standards that her predecessors never faced, that every decision she made would be analyzed not just for its policy merits, but for what it said about whether a black woman could lead effectively. The stage lights were bright and hot when she stepped into view, and the crowd's reaction was complex, a mix of enthusiastic applause from supporters and more measured acknowledgement from others who were still processing the morning's events. And Regina could see faces in the audience ranging from tear-streaked to skeptical, could see reporters with cameras trained on her every movement, could see Officer Brennan standing near the back with other police officers, his face still showing the devastation of his error. Judge Rodriguez moved to the podium, and her voice carried authority and warmth as she welcomed everyone to this historic occasion, as she acknowledged that the morning had been unusual and challenging, but that it had also revealed something important about the work that lay ahead, about the necessity of confronting bias and building genuine inclusion rather than just performing diversity. Regina stood beside her, hand resting on the worn Bible that had belonged to Mama Ruth, the leather cover cracked and soft from decades of use, and she thought about her grandmother's hands turning these pages, seeking comfort and guidance in scriptures that promised justice and redemption. And she felt connected across time to a lineage of black women who'd found ways to survive and resist and flourish, despite systems designed to contain them. Judge Rodriguez administered the oath, and Regina repeated the words with steady voice, promising to uphold the Constitution and serve all citizens of Riverside faithfully and to the best of her ability. And when Maria said, "Congratulations, Mayor Hayes," the title felt both surreal and absolutely right, felt like something she'd been preparing for her entire life, even when she hadn't known that's what she was doing. The applause was sustained and genuine, or at least the portion of it from her core supporters was genuine, while the rest ranged from obligatory to resistant, and Regina stepped to the podium with her prepared remarks in hand, but knowing she would abandon most of them in favor of speaking directly to the moment they were all living through. She looked out at the sea of faces, at Janet Chen in the front row, and Terrence Williams, the young intern who'd tried to intervene during the confrontation, and Maria Gonzalez, the custodial supervisor who'd arrived for the ceremony in her work uniform because her shift didn't end until noon. And Regina made a decision to speak not just to the people in this room, but to everyone in Riverside who'd ever been made invisible, everyone who'd been dismissed or diminished or told implicitly or explicitly that they didn't belong in spaces of power and decision-making. "My grandmother used to say," Regina began, her voice strong and clear despite the emotions churning beneath the surface, that the measure of a society isn't how it treats its powerful, it's how it treats its invisible. And this morning, I was reminded in the most direct way possible what invisibility feels like, what it means to stand in a space you have every right to occupy and be told you don't belong there, to be categorized and dismissed based on assumptions about who does what kind of work and who occupies what kind of position in our social hierarchy. She recounted the morning's events without naming Brennan or Morrison specifically, but making clear what had happened, how she'd been questioned and detained and called a maid while preparing for her own inauguration, and she watched the audience's reactions range from shock among those who hadn't yet heard to uncomfortable recognition among those who'd witnessed it directly or seen the viral videos. Some of you are wondering, Regina continued, why I'm addressing this publicly rather than handling it through administrative channels, why I'm starting my tenure as mayor by talking about a painful personal experience rather than outlining my policy agenda. And the answer is that this incident isn't just personal, it's systemic. It's not about one officer or one councilman making mistakes. It's about the patterns of assumption and bias that shape every interaction in our society, that determine who gets questioned and who gets trusted, who gets dismissed and who gets respect, who is assumed to be in service positions and who is assumed to be in leadership positions. She felt the room's attention sharpening, felt people leaning forward, and she knew she had them fully present in a way that prepared speeches about infrastructure and economic development never could have achieved, because she was speaking about something real and immediate and emotionally resonant rather than abstract policy proposals. Regina shared her mother's story then, the narrative about Lorraine Hayes, who'd cleaned surgical floors at Riverside Medical Center for 30 years and who'd saved Dr. Michael Whitman's life by recognizing heart attack symptoms and initiating CPR, and who'd then been misidentified as a security guard because the doctor couldn't see clearly enough past his assumptions to register that his savior had been a black woman in a cleaning uniform. My mother never corrected him, Regina said, her voice thick with emotion, never insisted on recognition or credit, because for her it wasn't about being seen, it was about doing right. But I'm telling you her story today because we can't keep operating in a society where people's contributions and capabilities and humanity are invisible to us unless they fit our preconceived notions of who belongs where. She paused and looked directly at the cameras, knowing this speech would be clipped and shared and analyzed, knowing that her words here would set the tone not just for her administration, but for broader conversations about race and power and respect that were happening across America in the aftermath of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless others whose invisibility had become fatal. The custodial staff who clean this building, Regina continued, the cafeteria workers who prepare the meals that fuel our meetings, the maintenance crews who keep our systems running, the administrative assistants who manage the logistics that allow elected officials to focus on policy, all of these people deserve the same respect and recognition that we automatically extend to department directors and city council members, and yes, to mayors, because their work is essential and their dignity is inherent. And if we can't see that, if we can't honor that, then we have no business calling ourselves leaders or claiming to serve the public good. The applause started slowly, but built steadily. And Regina saw Maria Gonzalez crying openly, saw other custodial staff in their uniforms standing and clapping, and she also saw some city council members shifting uncomfortably, saw business leaders in expensive suits looking uncertain about whether this direction was productive or divisive. And she didn't care because she hadn't run for mayor to make powerful people comfortable. She'd run to make invisible people seen. Before Regina could continue with her policy commitments and vision for Riverside's future, she did something that no one expected and that her advisors would have counseled against if they'd known she was planning it. She paused mid-speech and said, "There's someone I need to acknowledge publicly, someone who made a mistake this morning that has been captured on video and shared widely. And I want to invite Officer Marcus Brennan to join me on this stage, because transformation doesn't happen through shame and punishment alone. It happens through honest reckoning and genuine commitment to change." The atrium went completely silent, the kind of silence that feels like held breath, and Regina could see Brennan's face go pale as every person in the room turned to look at him as his fellow officers stepped slightly away, creating a circle of isolation. And for a moment, she thought he might refuse, might turn and walk out rather than face this public moment of accountability. But then he began moving forward through the crowd, his steps heavy and reluctant, but steady, and when he climbed the stairs to the stage, his hands were visibly shaking. Officer Marcus Brennan stood beside Regina on the stage, with his shoulders hunched as if bracing against physical blows, and she could see the internal war playing across his features, the competing impulses to defend himself or flee or collapse entirely under the weight of public scrutiny and private shame. Regina turned to face him directly, and her voice remained measured and clear as she addressed him through the microphone so that everyone in the atrium and everyone watching the live stream could hear her words. "Officer Brennan," she said, "you've served this city for 12 years. You've received commendations for bravery. You've responded to emergencies and protected citizens and put your life on the line in service to Riverside. And I believe those contributions are real and valuable. But this morning, when you encountered me cleaning a coffee spill, you made assumptions based on my race and my appearance. You categorized me as someone who needed to be controlled and questioned and potentially removed from this building. And those assumptions weren't unique to you. They were the product of training and culture and societal conditioning that teaches all of us to associate certain bodies with certain roles." Brennan's face was streaked with tears now, and he seemed unable to speak, his throat working but producing no sound. And Regina felt no satisfaction in his distress because she understood that humiliation alone changed nothing, that public shame could just as easily produce defensive hardening as genuine transformation. She placed her hand on Brennan's shoulder in a gesture that surprised everyone, including herself, a physical connection that communicated something more complex than simple forgiveness or condemnation, something about shared humanity and the possibility of growth even after profound failure. "Tell them," Regina said gently but firmly, "tell everyone here what you saw this morning and what you're learning about your own biases, because your honesty might help other people recognize their own blind spots, might create space for the kind of uncomfortable self-examination that genuine change requires." Brennan took several shuddering breaths before he managed to speak, and when his voice emerged, it was rough with emotion, but audible through the microphone that someone had quickly positioned near him. "I saw a black woman with cleaning supplies," he said slowly, as if forcing each word past internal resistance, and my brain immediately created a story about who she was and what she was doing here. And that story felt so natural and obvious that I never questioned it. I never paused to consider that I might be wrong. I just acted on my assumptions with complete confidence that I was doing my job correctly. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and continued, his words coming faster now, as if momentum was carrying him past his initial reluctance. "I've been a police officer for 12 years, and I've prided myself on being fair and professional. I've never used racial slurs or deliberately discriminated against anyone. I go to Mass every Sunday at Our Lady of Perpetual Help, and I volunteer with youth programs, and I genuinely believe I'm a good person. But this morning showed me that good intentions don't protect you from causing harm when your perceptions are shaped by bias that you haven't examined or challenged." The audience reaction was varied and visceral, some people nodding with recognition, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Regina could see her campaign team looking uncertain about whether this approach was brilliant or disastrous. whether her decision to create this moment of public vulnerability would be celebrated or criticized in tomorrow's headlines and social media analysis. She let Brennan's words settle for a moment before she continued speaking, before she pivoted from the personal testimony to the systemic implications. What Officer Brennan experienced this morning, what he's describing now, isn't an individual pathology that we can isolate and punish. It's a collective illness that infects all of us to varying degrees, and the only cure is sustained commitment to awareness and accountability and cultural change. She turned back to address the full audience, her hand still resting on Brennan's shoulder in a gesture that anchored them both. I'm announcing today that within 30 days, every city employee will begin participating in comprehensive bias awareness training that goes beyond checking boxes for compliance and actually creates space for the kind of honest reckoning that Officer Brennan has demonstrated here. Training that acknowledges the ways that racism and sexism and classism shape our perceptions and interactions, even when we don't consciously intend harm. Regina outlined her vision for this training, explaining that it would be developed in partnership with Riverside Community College's Sociology Department and the local chapter of the NAACP and community organizations, like the Riverside Interfaith Coalition that represented the city's diverse religious communities, including the 70% of residents who identified as Christian across Catholic and Protestant denominations. The growing Muslim population centered around the Islamic Center. On Madison Avenue, the Jewish congregation at Temple Beth Shalom, and the smaller communities of Buddhists and Hindus and practitioners of other faiths who all contributed to Riverside's increasingly multicultural character. The training wouldn't be punitive, she emphasized, it would be educational, creating space for city employees to examine their own conditioning and biases without fear of being labeled irredeemably racist. Because transformation required vulnerability, and vulnerability required safety, even as accountability required consequences for those who refused to engage in good faith. She announced the creation of a civilian oversight board with real power to review complaints and recommend disciplinary action, a board that would include not just lawyers and business owners but also service workers and community members who'd been disproportionately impacted by discriminatory practices, because the people who experienced harm most directly needed to have voice in creating solutions. The policy announcements continued as Regina laid out her first 100 days agenda, commitments to equitable development that wouldn't displace long-time residents from neighborhoods like the historically black community around Riverside Baptist Church on 7th Street, or the predominantly Latino neighborhoods near Patterson Manufacturing, where families had lived for generations. She promised reforms to the city's hiring practices, including blind resume reviews that would prevent names from triggering unconscious bias, and partnerships with community colleges and trade schools to create pipelines for residents who'd been locked out of government employment due to credentialing requirements that served more to maintain class barriers than to ensure competence. She announced a living wage requirement for all city contractors, pointing out that Riverside couldn't claim to value dignity and respect while paying workers poverty wages to clean buildings or maintain parks or provide food services. Every promise was specific and concrete, grounded in budget realities she'd spent months analyzing with her policy team, and she emphasized that these weren't aspirational goals to be achieved over multiple terms. They were immediate priorities that would begin implementation within weeks. The most revolutionary proposal Regina announced was what she called the Visibility Initiative, a program that would require city leadership, including herself, to spend 1 day per month working alongside different departments, not as symbolic photo opportunities, but as genuine efforts to understand the daily realities of city employees across the hierarchy. "I will be cleaning floors alongside custodial staff," she said. "I will be riding routes with sanitation workers. I will be answering phones in constituent services because I believe that leadership divorced from the lived experience of the people being led becomes abstract and disconnected and ultimately harmful, and I refuse to become so isolated in this office that I forget what it feels like to perform the essential labor that makes government function. The announcement generated mixed reactions, applause from service workers and progressive activists, skeptical expressions from some city council members who clearly thought this was performative rather than substantive. But Regina didn't care about the skepticism because she knew that consistent action over time would demonstrate whether her commitments were genuine or merely rhetorical. She invited Councilman Morrison to join her and Brennan on stage, and Morrison came forward with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to cameras and public speaking, though his face showed calculation about how to position himself in this moment. Regina addressed him directly but publicly, asking him to sponsor legislation that would codify these initiatives and allocate dedicated funding for implementation rather than treating them as voluntary programs dependent on administrative goodwill. Morrison agreed with the smooth rhetoric of someone who recognized political necessity, promising to work with her office to develop comprehensive reform packages, and Regina made mental note to hold him accountable because she knew that verbal commitments made under pressure often evaporated once public attention moved to other issues. She announced that both Brennan and Morrison would serve on the implementation committee for bias training, that they would share their experiences from this morning as part of the curriculum, because she believed that people who'd made mistakes and acknowledged them and committed to growth could be powerful teachers, more effective than experts who'd never personally confronted their own biases. The ceremony was already running long, well past the scheduled time for completion, but Regina sensed that the audience was engaged rather than restless, that something significant was happening that transcended typical political theater. She pivoted finally to the closing section of her speech, the vision statement she'd crafted weeks earlier, but now needed to reframe through the lens of everything that had occurred. Riverside stands at a crossroads, she said, her voice rising with passion that came from deep conviction rather than performative emotion. We can continue operating as we always have, with unexamined assumptions determining who gets respect and who gets dismissed, with informal hierarchies that value some forms of labor and devalue others, with blind spots that allow good people to cause harm without even recognizing it. Or we can choose the harder path of genuine transformation. We can commit to seeing each other fully and honestly, to honoring the dignity inherent in every person, regardless of their job title or income level or skin color or immigration status or any other category we use to sort people into hierarchies of worth. She spoke about her vision for Riverside as a model city where equity wasn't just aspirational language in planning documents, but lived reality in budget allocations and hiring practices and community engagement, where the voices of residents living in subsidized housing carried the same weight as the voices of business owners and property developers, where decisions about public safety involved the communities being policed rather than being imposed on them by officials who lived in different neighborhoods and experienced different realities. She acknowledged that this vision would generate resistance, that change always threatened people who benefited from existing arrangements, that she would be criticized and opposed, and probably face recall efforts from those who preferred the comfortable predictability of the status quo. But she committed to pursuing transformation anyway because the alternative was continuing to perpetuate systems that harmed vulnerable residents while concentrating benefits among those who already had power and resources. Some of you voted for me, she said, looking out across the diverse audience. Some of you voted against me. Some of you didn't vote at all because you'd stopped believing that government could work for people like you. But regardless of where you stood in November, you're all my responsibility now. You're all citizens of this city whose well-being and opportunities and dignity matter equally, and I promise to lead with that principle guiding every decision." Regina concluded by returning to her grandmother's wisdom about invisibility and sight, about the power that came from being dismissed by people who then revealed themselves completely because they believed no one was watching. "This morning I was invisible," she said, her voice carrying emotion that resonated through the atrium's excellent acoustics. "I was looked at and looked through and categorized and dismissed by people who couldn't see me because their vision was clouded by assumptions and bias. But I'm standing here now, very visible, very present, very real. And the question facing all of us isn't whether I deserve to occupy this office. The question is, how many other people in Riverside are still invisible? How many residents and workers and students and families are being overlooked and underestimated and erased, and what we're going to do collectively to ensure that everyone gets seen and valued and respected." The final words of her inaugural address were directed at the children in the audience, the young people watching from school classrooms via live stream, the next generation who would inherit whatever Riverside became through the decisions made today and in the years ahead. She told them that they could be anything they wanted to be, regardless of what people assumed about them based on their appearance, that they could be mayors and doctors and engineers and artists and teachers, that their dreams were valid and achievable and worth pursuing even when others couldn't see their potential, and that the greatest power they possessed was the power to see each other clearly and honestly and compassionately, to refuse the categories and hierarchies that previous generations had accepted as natural, to build a society that actually lived up to its stated values of equality and justice and dignity for all. The standing ovation that followed was sustained and genuine, lasting several minutes as people rose from their seats in waves, and Regina saw tears on faces across the audience from custodial staff to council members, saw Terence, the young intern, openly weeping with what looked like hope rather than pain, saw Maria Gonzalez being embraced by co-workers, saw Officer Brennan still standing beside her, with his face showing something like relief mixed with determination. Judge Rodriguez returned to the podium to offer closing remarks and a benediction, invoking blessings in English and Spanish, asking for wisdom and compassion to guide Riverside's new leadership and all its citizens toward a future characterized by justice and mutual flourishing. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of ceremonial keys to the city and the playing of Riverside's official anthem, a piece commissioned in 1976 for the nation's bicentennial that celebrated the city's history as a crossroads where different peoples and cultures had mixed and sometimes clashed, but ultimately created something richer than homogeneity could ever produce. As the crowds began dispersing and Regina moved through the receiving line of well-wishers and critics and curious observers, she felt the weight of everything that had happened settling into her bones. The exhaustion and exhilaration of having survived a morning that could have destroyed her before her tenure even officially began, but that she'd somehow transformed into a teaching moment that might actually catalyze change. She shook hundreds of hands, accepted embraces and congratulations, and a few cold shoulders from those who thought she'd been too confrontational or too forgiving depending on their perspective. And she answered questions from reporters who wanted to know whether she planned to file formal complaints against Brennan and Morrison, whether she thought white police officers could be effective in black neighborhoods after this morning's incident, whether she was using race as a weapon to deflect. From her lack of executive experience, Regina answered each question with patience she didn't entirely feel, refusing to be baited into sound bites that would be stripped of context and used against her, insisting that the story wasn't about individual villainy or victimhood, but about systemic patterns that required collective acknowledgement and commitment to change. By early afternoon, Regina finally escaped to her office, where her team had assembled for what was supposed to be a celebratory lunch, but felt more like a debriefing session after a crisis, and they gathered around the conference table with sandwiches from Riverside Deli and cookies from Corner Bakery that no one had much appetite for because the emotional intensity of the morning had left everyone depleted. Marcus, her campaign manager, looked simultaneously proud and worried as he showed her the metrics from social media, where the inauguration speech was being shared widely, with hashtags like real leadership and transformative justice trending alongside the more critical responses, accusing her of reverse racism or playing politics with legitimate law enforcement. Janet Chen had compiled a folder of initial reactions from city department heads and council members, responses ranging from enthusiastic support to carefully worded neutrality to barely concealed hostility, and Regina absorbed all of it, knowing that these early reactions would shape the dynamics of governance going forward, would determine who became genuine allies and who remained obstacles requiring strategic navigation. Her policy director, Sarah Martinez, raised concerns about timeline feasibility for the initiatives Regina had announced, questioning whether 30 days was realistic for developing comprehensive training programs and establishing civilian oversight structures. And Regina listened to the objections before saying firmly that they would meet the timeline, even if it meant working 16-hour days, because credibility required following through quickly on commitments made publicly. The afternoon dissolved into a series of meetings with department heads and brief ceremonial obligations, including a reception at City Hall where Regina smiled through exhaustion and made small talk with donors and community leaders while her feet ached in the heels she'd worn for too many hours. By 6 o'clock, she was finally alone in the mayor's office, the building quiet again as employees departed for dinner with families or evening activities, and Regina stood at the window watching sunset paint Riverside's skyline in shades of orange and purple, watching lights begin flickering on in office towers and apartment buildings, watching the city settle into evening rhythms. She thought about calling her best friend Keisha, who taught 4th grade at Roosevelt Elementary, and who'd been like a sister throughout the campaign, but she didn't have energy for conversation, even with someone who loved her unconditionally. So instead, she just stood at the window and let herself feel everything she'd been suppressing all day, the hurt and anger and fear and hope, all swirling together in ways she couldn't quite articulate. 6 months would pass before Regina fully understood the impact of that inauguration morning. 6 months of implementing the policies she'd promised and navigating resistance and building coalitions and discovering which council members were genuine partners and which were perpetual opponents. The bias training program launched on schedule and proved more effective than skeptics had predicted, with 90% of city employees completing the initial modules and survey data showing measurable shifts in awareness, if not yet in behavior. The Civilian Oversight Board began operations with Maria Gonzalez serving as one of its members, her perspective as someone who'd spent decades being invisible in City Hall, proving invaluable for identifying patterns others missed. Officer Brennan became one of the program's most compelling facilitators, his willingness to share his mistakes and growth process, creating space for other officers to examine their own biases without feeling personally attacked. And while some colleagues viewed him as a traitor, most recognized that his vulnerability demonstrated strength rather than weakness. On a Tuesday morning, 6 months after her inauguration, Regina arrived at City Hall at her usual early hour and found a young black girl named Destiny waiting with her mother, who worked in the finance department, and Destiny's eyes went wide when she saw Regina approaching. "Are you the mayor?" Destiny asked with the directness of children who hadn't yet learned to soften their questions, and Regina knelt down to meet the girl's eyes and said, "Yes, I am. What's your name?" "Destiny Martinez," the girl answered, and then added, "I want to be mayor someday. Can girls like me be mayor?" And Regina felt tears threatening because the question contained both hope and doubt, both possibility and awareness of obstacles. "Not someday," Regina said firmly, taking Destiny's small hand in hers. "Start today. Start by seeing everyone around you and treating them with respect. Start by speaking up when you see unfairness. Start by believing that you belong in any space you choose to occupy. And when you're old enough to run for mayor, I'll be your first campaign volunteer." She gave Destiny a tour of the office, showing her the desk where decisions got made and the window with its view of Riverside, and the framed photos, including one of Mama Ruth, that Regina kept as reminder of where she'd come from and why she'd fought so hard to arrive here. After Destiny and her mother left, Regina sat at her desk with morning coffee and reviewed the agenda for the day ahead. Meetings about affordable housing development and public safety reform and infrastructure repair. The endless work of governance that never felt adequate to the scale of need, but that sometimes, in accumulated small decisions, actually moved systems toward greater justice. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago kneeling with paper towels while a police officer questioned her right to exist in this building. And she thought about the journey from that moment of invisibility to this morning's encounter with a child who could imagine herself as mayor because she'd seen someone who looked like her occupying that role. The work was far from finished, would never be finished, because justice was a direction rather than a destination. But Regina felt grounded in purpose, connected to lineage of resistance and resilience that stretched back through her mother and grandmother to ancestors whose names she'd never learned, but whose strength she'd inherited. She touched the Bible on her desk and whispered thank you to Mama Ruth for teaching her that invisibility could be a teacher, that being unseen revealed more about the unseeing than about those they failed to notice, and that the greatest gift she could give was helping others learn to see clearly and love broadly and lead humbly.